So we'll just get started. So as you guys will know from the Eventbrite email, that today's session is being recorded, so that's it, just started now, just so that you're all aware. So yeah, welcome to today's webinar on supporting families experiencing anxiety on the return to school. So our webinar today will be done by some of us from the CAMHS early intervention team in NHS Grampian. So you'll have myself, Natasha Vickers, and then you'll have Anastasia and Milena, who are also advanced psychology practitioners in the team, and then we also have Karen and Holly, who are psychology practitioners in the team as well. So some of you will have been to our first webinar, so this is our second webinar kind of in the wee series that we're thinking about doing. So welcome everyone. So just a couple of things before we start. So if everyone could make sure your microphones and cameras are off and on mute, just to reduce feedback, but also because it's on the recording, I'm sure lots of you don't want to just be sitting on the recording and looking and listening. So it just means that your faces aren't on it as well, which is great. As we go along, feel free to write questions in the chat box. So we're going to have about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar today, just to answer any questions that you guys have about our content. So feel free to do the questions as we go along, and we'll kind of pick them up at the end so that you can get more questions answered. And just kind of remember that we won't be able to answer questions about specific cases, and also just keep in mind confidentiality when you're typing in questions as well. And as I said, we're recording the session, so just aware that any questions that you ask will be available for everyone watching the recording as well. And after today's webinar, we're going to put the recording as well as the slides, and we'll send out the slides via email along with a frequently asked question sheet, which will just encompass all the questions that you guys ask today. We'll email out both frequently asked question sheet and the presentation, but the recording will be available to view on the CAMHS website, as well as the National Improvement Hub website, so just be aware of that as well. And as you guys know, this is our second webinar in the series. So our first webinar, we asked everyone to complete an evaluation form at the end, which is how this webinar then came about. So it'd be really helpful if you guys could fill out our evaluation form at the end. We'll put a link to it in the chat, and we'll send out an email with a link to it, just to see if there's anything you guys find helpful, what you would have liked more of. And if there's any further webinars you'd like in the future, it's definitely something we're thinking about. And this is a kind of pilot, so it would be great to have as much feedback as you're able to give. And part of today's webinar is we've put in some case studies. These are some that we've just created ourselves based on what we'd be expecting children to be experiencing when coming back to school. So none of them are based on real patients, so any similarities are purely coincidental, just in case you're wondering. So the aims of today's webinar is to help you guys understand what anxiety is, how to recognise it, and what this might look like in light of COVID. And we'll also have a think about exploring ways to support children and their families both in school and at home, things you can suggest to take home for children experiencing anxiety. So the things we'll look at today is we'll have a think about what anxiety is, what it looks like, and what it looks like in COVID. We'll also have a think about what we've called universal strategies. So these are things that you can use with all children experiencing anxiety regardless of their age. And then we've created some case studies that we split into primary and secondary age, purely just to make it easier for the case study. And then we've got some strategies per case study that are more specific to the types of issues that the children have been experiencing. All of the strategies that we've listed in the case studies can be used for primary or secondary age. It doesn't matter. We've just put it per age, just so they're specific to the case study. And then we'll have about 15 minutes of questions at the end. So we've got quite a bit to get through today. So we'll just have a start with what anxiety is. So anxiety is our body's normal response to a perceived threat or danger. So our caveman ancestors needed anxiety to keep them safe from the likes of dinosaurs and saber-toothed tigers and all those sorts of things. So what they do is decide if they be ready to fight whatever danger was sitting in front of them, if they are better to run away and that's going to keep them safe, or if they're better to freeze and hide from this threat that's in front of them. So to do that, their bodies would start this fight, flight, freeze response, and there's a wee picture of it with the little girl just on your right there. And the kind of things that would happen in your body are, you know, feeling hot and sweaty, your heart starting to beat really fast, your lungs starting to fill up. And that's just to get your body ready to either fight, to run away, or to freeze. So, you know, your heart beating really fast to pump a lot more oxygen around your body, and you're struggling to breathe, trying to get more oxygen into your lungs so that it can go around your body. And, you know, some people feel their muscles really tight. Some people get like shaky legs and things. That's just the extra adrenaline running through your body to get you ready to fight, flight, or freeze. But these days we don't have dinosaurs or saber-toothed tigers in the world anymore, thank goodness. But our brains are more advanced, and there are emotional threats as well as physical ones in the world. And we can think about the threats that are about using a smoke alarm analogy. So some of you might have heard about this before. And that's just that, as we all know, having a smoke alarm fitted in our houses is the most helpful thing in the world, because if there were to be a fire, you know, it would go off and it would let us know, get out the house to keep you safe. However, we also know how frustrating it is when you are trying to make toast, or you're trying to grill bacon, and the smoke alarm keeps going off, and you're like, I know there's not fire, I can see it in front of me, why does this thing keep going off? And it's really, really frustrating. So anxiety can be like this sometimes. You know, we need the smoke alarm. We need our anxiety, because actually it's really helpful for situations like sitting an exam. It's going to make us, because it can help us think clearer, it can make us perform better. But also things like crossing a road. You know, if there is danger coming, it helps us know that there is something we need to get out of the way of. However, sometimes they can be too sensitive, like the toast or the bacon, and sometimes it can be going off in situations where we don't need it to go off. And it makes these really unpleasant feelings happen when there's no danger around. And these can be really unpleasant for children and young people to see and for them to feel, and also for us to see them struggling to manage these feelings of anxiety. So things like, you know, naming the anxiety and saying, you know, from these slides, I understand what anxiety is. I know why these things are happening inside your body, and saying, actually, maybe you're just feeling worried about that, and that's okay. And considering the current climate right now, it's something that we're all feeling. Everyone's feeling anxious, and that's totally allowed and okay, because feeling worried about COVID is a normal thing and an okay thing to feel worried about. So what does anxiety look like? So this is not an exhaustive list. I'm not going to read through all of them. Obviously, the slides are going to be available afterwards, but I'll just pick a couple out that you're probably going to notice a wee bit more often. So especially this week and next week, children struggling to separate from their parent and carer, you know, needing people to walk them right into class, needing that extra support. You might also notice that children are avoiding situations that make them feel uncomfortable. So, you know, maybe they've not been going out with friends, or they're saying, you know, I really, really just don't want to come to school. I just can't do it. You might find children acting out to get out of class because they just can't cope. You know, children haven't been around other people much for the last couple of months, so it's going to be really difficult. You might also notice a lot of reassurance seeking. So asking, you know, did everyone wash their hands? Is this the rules? You know, I thought maybe my lunch didn't taste today. Do I need to get a COVID test? So asking lots of reassurance and repeating it over and over again. And you might see that they start with one teacher and then go to all the teachers just to keep getting that reassurance. You might notice people complaining about somatic symptoms, so your sore heads and sore tummies. These are things that we'd expect to notice in your younger children more often, but across the age range, you know, we feel it when we're feeling anxious as well. You might notice some children struggling to concentrate or daydreaming quite a bit as well. We know that actually when you're feeling anxious, it can affect some of the bits in your brain that make it really hard to take in learning and to be able to learn. So we know that that might be difficult for a lot of children. And your kind of things like struggling with sleep, feeling more angry, feeling more irritable, or feeling a bit more sad. So we thought it'd also be helpful to have a wee think about what would be normal fears for children developmentally. So these are a list of fears that wouldn't be, I guess, ones that you'd necessarily always needing support over. So in your kind of early childhood, so your 5 to 7 years, so worrying about natural disasters, worrying about family members, those kinds of things. In middle childhood, so 8 to 11, worrying about academic performance, worrying about being told off, worrying about friendship problems. And in adolescence, things that are a lot more social or worrying about the future, so exam worries, worrying about how other people view them and things like that. And obviously, in light of COVID, these things have been exacerbated a lot. A lot of the fears that children already would have developmentally have come to light and have been brought to the forefront with COVID. So it would make sense that anxiety is increased overall at this point. So thinking now specifically about anxiety in COVID, the kinds of things that children might be worrying about. Some families might have been shielding. For the shielding families, they've not been able to leave the house much basically the whole of the year, and they've only been able to kind of resume, I guess, normal life for the last couple of weeks. So that's going to be really difficult for families who have been shielding. Some children might not be used, well, all children won't be used to being around large groups of people. We're not really used to it either. So even if they've been seeing their friends and going out quite a lot, it still won't be to the level that it's like in school. So that'll be very overwhelming for most children. It's a new school year that they're coming back to. Some children will have potentially new teachers, new classrooms. Some will be going to new schools, and they'll be worrying what this looks like, even if they've been watching the kind of 360 videos and the pictures that you guys have sent through. They'll be wondering what it feels like to actually be there. Some families might be worried about the risks about their children returning to school. So will my child bring back COVID? Are we under more risk as a family if my child goes to school? Some families may have experienced loss during this period, which will obviously be very difficult returning to school. Some families might have not had the same access to homeschooling as others and might be feeling worried about being behind their peers. So some people may have just generally struggled doing the homeschooling and getting the work done. Others might have not had access to the same technology or the same Wi-Fi speed and things like that. So it's worth keeping that in mind as well, that all children will be coming in at different levels and they might be feeling worried about that. Some of the adolescents might be feeling upset about exam results. Obviously, the normal exam procedure was disrupted, and for a lot of children, it's disadvantaged them. So worrying about the implications of this in their future, you know, am I going to be coming in and needing to do different classes than I'd already picked? What's that going to look like for my future? Will I still be able to do what I want to do when I leave school? And children and families might be worried about getting stuff wrong. So not following the no rules right, you know, worrying about, you know, am I going in the exit door? Am I going in the entrance door? Have I packed my child everything that they need for school? Do they have a packed lunch? Do they have everything the way that it needs to be? So a lot of families will be worrying about that. So it's helpful to think about anxiety within an anxiety cycle, and this just helps us have a think about what's going on for the young person in front of us and the family in front of us a bit more clearly. So it's helpful to think about it in thoughts, feelings, body sensations and behaviours, and how these all interact with each other and can sometimes make us feel more worried. So we've completed an anxiety cycle for each of the case studies as we go along as well, and it can be quite helpful if there's certain young people that you're thinking of in the school to have a think about this as well. So just an example, the situation, so worrying whether going back to school will give me COVID. So then the thoughts that this young person could start having would be, you know, is everyone following the rules? Is my school safe? Did my lunch taste funny? Do I need to get a COVID test? Having all those kinds of thoughts. And as those thoughts start, you know, the feelings about feeling worried, anxious, maybe angry at some of their peers if they don't think they're following the rules, feeling upset or scared. And then our kind of fight, flight, freeze symptoms start. So sore tummy, sore throat, feeling shaky, finding it really hard to breathe, heart beating really fast. Obviously, these things are so unpleasant to feel that they're struggling to pay attention in class. They're having all these thoughts and these feelings and these things happening in their body. You know, it's really difficult to pay attention. They might be asking teachers to repeat the rules, making sure that they're definitely following them, checking their friends have washed their hands, you know, maybe even telling their friends off or getting quite angry at their friends. And then, you know, sometimes the feelings, the thoughts and the body sensations just get too much and they just say, no, I can't cope with this. I have a sore tummy, I need to go home. And by doing that, the young person then learns that they can't cope with these feelings of anxiety, and the anxiety can then get worse. So the kind of strategies that we thought of and we're going to give you ideas to try are things that can kind of stop this cycle and break it up at different points and help with each of the thoughts, feelings, body sensations and behaviours. So I will pass you over to Anastasia, who's going to go through some of the universal strategies.
Hi everyone, so I'm just going to talk through some general approaches or strategies that you can think about to support children in the classroom environment. So first off, listening, acknowledging and validating feelings. We know if children have the opportunity to express their worries and have the chance to feel listened to and validated, that can be a really helpful experience for them. So you can do that just by being curious, asking questions such as, I wonder how you're feeling today, keeping those open-ended, encouraging them to verbalise that, write it down or draw it. And then feeding back what you've heard them say. I hear that you're worried about some changes in school, and then normalising and saying, that's okay. It's quite normal to feel anxious in that situation. And we know it doesn't feel very nice. Linking back to what Natasha was talking about some of those symptoms we feel in our body when we're anxious. And that can just be really helpful for children to start to make those links. Sometimes people wonder if talking about anxiety will make it worse, but we know actually the more we talk about it, it can be really helpful. So you can think about, is there a supportive adult in the school who the child can meet with to talk about any worries that they have, or will they have time set aside, as that can help reduce some of that anxiety as well for the young people. Things like introducing a worry box in the classroom can be helpful, especially when at times when there's lots of uncertainty or changes, and you can keep that anonymous and then go through those worries at the end of the week. Identifying their anxiety cycle. So just having a think about what's going on for the child or young person and noticing any patterns in their behaviours. This can be really helpful because it can then help you identify where is it that you need to do something different, or you can problem solve, what do we need to do to support this child? Do we need to try something differently in school? Do we need to have some more communication with the family, or do we need to liaise with other services that are involved with this family? It's also nice if the child's old enough to have them be part of that process so they can make those links and they can also build their independent coping strategies as well. Some other things to consider when you're supporting anxious children is to limit reassurance. It's really normal to want to provide lots of reassurance to a child or young person, but we know that that's not so helpful in the long term. While in the short term it might reduce anxiety, it might feel like the child is never receiving enough and will keep asking for that reassurance. So trying to reduce phrases such as "you'll be fine" and "it'll be okay," and instead asking the child questions such as how have they coped before in that situation? What strategies do they have to manage? Can they do something to distract themselves? We'll talk a bit more on the next slide about what some of those strategies are. Classroom routines. We know that anxious children are prone to distress when there are unexpected changes in routine. So have a think about developing a classroom routine. If you're able to, write it up on a board every morning or display that visually. That will help reduce some of these children's anxiety also. Extra patience. Anxious children often worry what other people will think of them. Will they get the answer right? What will happen if they get something wrong? This worry means that they can take a bit longer to complete various tasks. So it's really important to allow extra time for these children, even 10 seconds or more to answer. In terms of strategies that you can use in the classroom and encourage children to use at home also. So if we think about the anxiety cycle, the first thing that we talked about was thoughts. So distraction is a great way to help shift the mind away from some of those worry thoughts. So encouraging the child or young person to engage in an activity which they find enjoyable, such as reading, drawing, or completing a puzzle. Relaxation exercises, they tap into the body sensations part of the anxiety cycle. What's great about relaxation exercises is that when we're doing them, it sends a message to the brain to calm down and to relax. It reduces some of those unpleasant physical symptoms that we experience when we're anxious and can help to break that anxiety cycle. So relaxation exercises, there's lots of those available, such as breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness exercises, yoga. These are all things that you can do with the class as well. Movement breaks. We know that moving around and exercise can help to use up some of the adrenaline that courses through our body when we're anxious. So just being aware of the children in your classroom, are you noticing that one of them starting to become overwhelmed or their behaviour starting to become a bit more challenging? Can you take a break and get everyone up and moving about? Or ask a child to go and deliver a message for you? Specific praise, tapping into that behaviour part of the anxiety cycle, really to encourage positive coping strategies. So acknowledging if you've noticed them display some brave behaviour or if you've noticed them use a helpful strategy. For example, I saw you taking some deep breaths this morning when you were coming into school. Well done. A timeout pass. This can be really helpful to give children and young people a feeling of control when actually anxiety makes us feel a bit out of control and overwhelmed. As a result, it can be hard to ask the teacher, please can I leave the class? So if they've got this card, that can help with that. And it also gives them a chance to put in place some strategies and to lower their arousal levels. Modelling coping self-talk and behaviour. This is important because it helps to normalise that everyone feels anxious from time to time, and that's okay. So if you're feeling anxious about something and it's appropriate to share that with the class, do say so, and then talk about how you're going to cope with that feeling of anxiety and what you might do yourself. As this will then encourage the children to do that when they're feeling a similar way. We've also thought about some strategies that might be particularly helpful for neurodiverse children. When we talk about neurodiverse children, we're thinking about the children that might have a specific learning difficulty, such as dyslexia or dyspraxia. They might have a learning disability. They might have a diagnosis of ADHD or autism. So these are strategies will be talked through in a bit more detail during the case studies, but just to go over them quickly, allowing children extra time to adapt to changes or to regulate their emotions. So we know that children that have some processing difficulties might just need that extra support and time to adjust to things that are new or unfamiliar. Visual aids and social stories. These can be really helpful for children that struggle with verbal information. So that, again, that can support changes within the school environment. Can you send them photos? Can you show them videos of changes? Can you make a visual timetable of what to expect during the day? Using things like timers to support with transition times, and giving children cards that they can use to communicate as well. if they struggle to verbalise how they're feeling. Clear and specific language. Avoiding use of ambiguous language and using fewer words when communicating. For example, you might have signs in the school that say keep left. What does that really mean? It might be that you have to walk that through with a child and take them around the whole building, explaining what they have to do and what that means for them. Repetition and breaking it down, making sure that the child understands what's expected and focusing on one thing at a time. So writing instructions down, using the picture aid or making a checklist for some of these children can also be really helpful. Sensory considerations. So this can be if children feel, it can be different for all children, and the things that you might want to think about are how they respond to those things in their environment. Do they need things like ear protection? Do they need a comforting tactile object or a wiggle cushion that might have been recognised during an assessment? I know Holly's going to talk through that in a bit more detail for one of the case studies in particular. And then finally, you can think about using special interests, so especially for those children with autism who might have a particular interest in something. You can identify what that special interest is and then think about how that can support with changes in school and also at home. I'm now going to pass on to Holly, who's going to talk through some case studies.
Hi there. So we've actually come up with 6 case studies, and that's 3 for primary and 3 for secondary. So we're just going to talk through those a little bit. The goal with the case studies was to try and come up with some of the common presentations that we're expecting that you'll see. We probably won't cover everything, but we do have some handouts coming out after the webinar that should answer any questions you do have. Now, these are not real case studies, they're just ones that we made up based on the presentations that we're expecting to see. But I'm hopeful that they'll be helpful in helping you understand how to apply the strategies that we've just talked about, but also thinking up student-specific strategies for the young people that you're working with. Okay, so this is Ben. Ben is 11 years old and has just started in P7. He lives with his mum and his younger sister. During lockdown, Ben spent most of his time playing online games like Fortnite and speaking to his friends over text. Ben would often stay up late playing games and sleep in during the day. Since coming back to school, Ben has been having meltdowns, talking back to his teachers, and not following some of the classroom rules like he did before. During quiet time, Ben will get up and move over to his friend's table or shout out without putting his hands up. At break time, Ben will run away from his teachers and refuse to go back into the classroom. Now, I think this is a presentation that we're all really familiar with, and I'm sure you've seen similar things since before COVID happened, but we're expecting that this is going to be a typical presentation for some of those people whose behaviour tends to go outwards, so tends to be more overt behaviour. So we can conceptualize it kind of within the anxiety cycle. So just as Natasha was talking about, if we think about the situation for Ben, he's really struggling with the back to school routine. The sensory input of the classroom seems to be really overwhelming. If we think about the thoughts that might be going through his head, might be a little bit worried about not managing the schoolwork. We know that he wasn't doing very much at home, and he might have been spending a lot of time on his games, so he might not be feeling very confident that he can complete the work. Maybe he'll worry his friends are laughing at him. Maybe he's worried about failure. We're not really sure about the thoughts that he's thinking unless he explains them to us, but we can kind of guess what might be going on for him. This is going to make him feel anxious. He's going to be restless. If he's worried about the work, he's going to do everything he can to not do the work. If he's feeling overwhelmed because there's too much stimulus, too many people in the classroom, this might make him frustrated. It might feel a little bit angry. It might just all be too much. This is going to affect how his body feels. So he might be fidgety, he might need something to fiddle with, but he might not have anything. He might be doodling, even though that might not be allowed. His general bodily arousal will be up. Thinking about that fight, flight, or freeze response, his general arousal is going to be going up, heart beating fast, his lungs breathing faster. Maybe he's got tingly arms and legs. And this is going to affect his behaviour. He might be getting out of his seat, avoiding school tasks, refusing to be in the class. He might just not be able to conform to some of the expectations that were present before COVID. He is not managing well in this situation, and it is really overwhelming for him. So when we think about specific strategies that would be helpful for Ben, now of course we have our universal list that Anastasia covered, but there's going to be some specific ones that will be helpful for Ben. So thinking about movement breaks, clearly he's really struggling with sitting down and working to the same amount of time as he did before. So providing him with movement breaks is going to keep him more engaged, and it's going to reduce the opportunity for him to go off task. Specific praise. If he is feeling a little bit worried about completing the work, then it might be helpful to have some really specific praise about what he's doing well and keeping engaged in the work when he is able to sit down and focus. We'd also kind of think about extra time. So he might need some extra time to complete the work that his peers is completing. If he hasn't been able to complete anything during the lockdown, he might need a bit of extra time to catch up. We can't expect everyone to be at the same level during lockdown, as they've all had really unique experiences. We would also recommend really clear and specific language. If he's not used to the expectations of the classroom, being really clear and specific in your instructions is going to help him do what you want him to do. In terms of school-specific advice, we're kind of recommending that you recognize there are many more distractions and stimulations in the classroom compared to at home. If we think about the case study, it said that he was staying in his room a lot playing games. And we know that he has a younger sister and a single mum. So if she's got her hands full with the young one, he might have spent a lot of time alone. He might be really not used to being around lots of people. It might be a really big adjustment that you're really not planning for. We would also suggest guided choices. So I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with this, but if we're thinking about Ben being overwhelmed, too much stimulus, too much noise, too much going on for him, providing him with guided choices is going to help him keep him engaged, because he'll still feel like he's making the choice, but without overwhelming him further. So for example, if he needs to get dressed for the playground, saying, do you want to put your coat on or your wellies first? Because he needs to do both, but he still gets to feel like he gets to choose. We also have some recommendations for home. Now you might not be comfortable with all of these, and you're going to have to pick and choose what feels right for you, but it might be helpful to contact mum, just to see about how his experience of lockdown was. How is his sleep? How is he managing? Maybe he doesn't have a very normal sleep routine at the moment. CAMHS resources have provided some really specific activities to look at sleep schedules, which we'll link to at the end of the webinar, but you can also direct Ben's mum to Sleep Scotland if she is looking for support for this. Similarly, how much time is Ben spending on social media? This is something you would need to speak to mum about. If you do have concerns that Ben is spending too much time on social media, maybe if he's been left alone by himself a lot, maybe we can think about giving some recommendations to mum on how to reduce this. Young Minds have some really good resources and guidance on how much time on social media is recommended. And then CAMHS resources also have some packs looking at social media consumption for young people. So we're going to look at our second case study, which is Aedan. Aedan is 8 years old and is currently in P5. Aedan is an only child and lives with his mum and dad. Aedan has some learning difficulties and found completing any schoolwork very difficult during the lockdown. Aedan's mum is a nurse at the local hospital and had to stay away from Aedan and dad for long periods of time during the pandemic. Aedan's dad has contacted school as he is worried that he won't manage the transition back to school. At home, Dad tells you that Aedan really struggles with hand washing and he doesn't like the feeling of hand sanitizer and sometimes gets scared by people wearing masks. So again, we're going to try and conceptualize this within the anxiety cycle. So thinking about Aedan struggling. There we go. So just thinking about Aedan struggling with returning to school, we can understand it within the context of thoughts, feelings, behaviours and body sensations. He might be really confused about why people are wearing masks. Maybe he's really uncomfortable about the feeling of hand sanitizer, and he might not be able to keep up with some of the content that's going on. This might be bringing up some really worried and scared feelings. He might be uncomfortable or frustrated and probably confused. There's lots of changes at school that might be really difficult for Aedan. And then if we think about body sensations, he might be feeling hot, fidgety, a sore tummy or a sore head, all of those anxiety symptoms that Natasha talked about. That might all be really overwhelming for Aedan. This might be affecting his behaviour. Maybe he's refusing to wash his hands. He's hiding from people in masks. Maybe he's having meltdowns when he becomes overwhelmed. He might be asking to go home because he knows that he's safe there. And we have all of our typical universal strategies that Anastasia talked about, but we would point your attention specifically towards classroom routines, having extra patience, clear and specific language, and repetition to break down your instructions. And then we kind of have some special considerations for Aedan. So sensory input for Aedan is clearly very important. If he's struggling with the feeling of hand sanitizer on his hands, then you need to think about how to support him with this. Similarly, you might want to introduce social stories or visual aids as a way to support Aedan when thinking about some of these new routines that we're asking young people to complete, particularly with unusual situations like mask wearing, which Aedan might not be useful if he hasn't been out a lot. In specific reference to school, we would really encourage you to contact Aedan's parents to find out how his experience of lockdown has been. Maybe there are some things that are going on at home that have worked really well that you could incorporate at school. For example, maybe Dad has discovered that Aedan has a big passion for Spider-Man, and you could demonstrate how to hand wash correctly on a Spider-Man doll, and that might really support him to introduce the idea of hand washing, and that be a bit more acceptable for him. Aedan's dad also might have learned some things about him that he didn't know. He's definitely spent a lot more time with him during lockdown, and maybe he's learned some specific strategies that help Aedan and could help you in the classroom. And then also thinking about offering breaks if he needs them. Is there someone he can go if he feels overwhelmed? And does he have safe adults that he could go to if he was struggling? We also have some specific information on supporting children like Aedan who also have learning disabilities. So thinking about remaining consistent, supporting Aedan's parents to have the same advice you have at school at home might be supportive for Aedan. If you have some specific signs at school about hand washing or maybe a song, could that be incorporated at home to make sure there's consistency between the two environments that he's spending the most time in? So we also recommend sending a schedule home to see what his day is going to look like. However, I know that this is going to differ for all of you. You might not have any more information than the parents at this point in time, and you might not have a schedule to provide. But we do know that children who are anxious really benefit from knowing what to expect when they're coming into a new environment. And then considering sensory needs. So we've talked about this a little bit already, but thinking about maybe fidget toys could be supportive for him. Maybe there's too much sensory input. Does he need maybe some headphones to cancel out the noise? Thinking about what his sensory needs are specific to him. It's going to have to be tailored to the individual. Visual tools, just as we've already covered now in next cards, I'm sure you're reasonably familiar. If you're not, we do have some in the CAMHS resources. And then thinking about the signage in your school. So this is something that's also come up for CAMHS, but will the children that you're working with understand the signage that's going up in your school? Do they understand what one-way system means? Do they know what keep left means? Do they know left from right? You know, is this going to need to be explained really clearly to the young person that you're working with? So thinking about how that's going to impact behaviour as well. So we're going to move on to some of the rest of the case studies, and I'll just hand over to Milena.
Okay, thank you, Holly. So yeah, I'm going to just have a look at some more case studies. So this next one will be another case study that's looking at a primary age child, and then we'll move on to older children in academy ages. So this case study is thinking about a girl, Gabby, who's 10. She's just about to enter P7, and she lives just with herself with her mum and dad, who were both furloughed in lockdown. So actually, although there was a lot of scary stuff around the pandemic, Gabby actually quite enjoyed being in lockdown because she got a lot of time with her mum and dad. They did lots of fun stuff together. And I mean, I don't know, there might be people that have been, at home in the holidays and felt the same, that actually it's nice to have had that time with family. It's nice to have had a bit more time together. So Gabby's feeling like she doesn't really sure she wants to go back to school, and also worrying a bit about coming out of that little safe family bubble and thinking, well, what if we get COVID? What's going to happen if one of us gets ill? So it's just kind of a situation that might come up for quite a lot of the young people that you'll be seeing as they return to school. So just thinking in terms of a little brief overview of how this anxiety cycle might be working for Gabby. So she's obviously worried about going to school, and she's just really missing her mum and dad. Her thoughts might be around COVID. What if I get it? What if I get sick? And it might just be that a lot of her thoughts are just about missing being at home, missing seeing mum and dad, and worrying a bit about them. So she might be like, having worried feelings, scared feelings, and just feeling a bit upset. She might complain about sore tummies, sore heads. I think a lot of students might say that either in the morning to their parents, so they kind of say, I've got a sore tummy before I go to school, or they might complain about that in school. And they might be hoping, when they think about their behaviour, they might kind of be hoping that they get a chance to maybe go back home to mum and dad if they say they're not well, or they might want to just call or text mum and dad to just check in with them a bit more. And you might notice that they're withdrawing a bit from yourselves or from their peers because they're just spending a lot of time thinking about their home life and what they're missing. So I guess if you think about the universal strategies that have been talked about before, so lots of these would be helpful for this situation with Gabby. I think having somebody acknowledging how she's feeling and thinking about the fact that actually she has had a really nice time in lockdown, and just saying I recognise it might be difficult coming back, and lots of people will have these worries. And I think it's just thinking about that kind of, limiting the reassurance again. So not overly focusing on what she's worried about, but trying to focus on what's really good about coming back to school, like the good things about seeing your friends and getting back into the routine. So I think in school that might be helpful, is to open up discussion around what children have enjoyed about lockdown, what they might be excited for about coming back. So shifting that focus to the positives. At home, her parents might be aware that she's feeling like this, and they might have their own worries about COVID and returning to school, as a lot of people do. So again, it can be about signposting to the resource packs that we'll link to at the end of these slides, so that the parents can maybe have a think with Gabby about some of those worries. And also thinking about, could the family still carry on some of the things that Gabby's really enjoyed? Are they still going to have particular traditions that they've got into the habit of doing in lockdown? Are they still going to have some family time? Because Gabby might really want to know they could schedule in family time maybe once a week, so she always knows that that's still coming even when they're separated for work and school, but that they will get that time again. And there's also another website that's listed on this slide, the Parent Club, which is another great place to signpost parents to if they're saying that this is something that they're worrying about with their child. So that's Gabby. So then we'll move on to the kind of older age group. So we'll just use another case study as an example. So this case study is thinking about Sarah, who's 15. Sarah lives alone with her mum, and she doesn't have any other family around. Her mum works at the hospital, so there's a lot of worries from Sarah about her mum maybe getting COVID, something bad happening to her, and actually what would happen to Sarah if that happened, because she would be on her own. So at home, she's been texting her mum lots of times, trying to see if she's okay. She's worrying, and she's thinking over and over, thinking about what is mum okay, what would happen if mum's not okay. and actually she's not really managing to settle until she's getting that reply from mum, which means that when she's in school, she's going to be finding it really hard to concentrate if those thoughts are running through her head and she's busy texting and waiting for replies. So obviously that can have a big impact on home and at school. So again, you can see the anxiety cycle, and you can imagine that kind of all these thoughts are going to be about mum and around mum and mum's safety, which can make her feel really worried, lonely, scared, upset. And she might actually start to get a bit of panic feeling, so that heart racing, breathing faster, because if she maybe has texted mum and hasn't had a response, she could start getting quite panicky and worried about that. Which again will just make that she's checking her phone constantly and double checking it, which is going to have a big impact on how she's managing to perform in class and even interacting with her peers and things. So I think, like the one before, this is about, I guess it's about an anxiety that is something that you want to shift the focus away from. So again, it's limiting that reassurance, but trying to focus on what can she do to help calm herself. Does she know about any relaxation exercises? Is there something to distract her with? And I'm thinking that actually, if this is about mum, it might be really important to involve mum. So this is one of those cases where, yeah, there's things you can do in school, but depending on how you feel about doing it, it might be something that you would want to contact mum about, to see how much is mum reassuring Sarah, how much is mum displaying anxiety herself, are they focusing a lot on COVID, are they talking a lot about it? So I think it's just trying to think about those things either with Sarah about mum or actually having that conversation with mum, and just kind of talking about why it maybe isn't a good idea to do lots of constant reassurance, because long term we know that that actually can create more anxiety and can maintain an anxiety cycle. Thinking as well with Sarah about a support network. Who else does she have that she could reach out to? Does she have family, friends, or other family, extended family that she could maybe speak to, even if that's just virtually? And also checking in about, how much time do they spend together, her and mum? Do they get enough time together? Does she need a bit more quality time with mum, even though mum's working, and that might be quite difficult? And because is she quite lonely? And that might be a really good thing about returning to school, because it might mean that she's able to interact with peers more again, and that might feel like it's actually quite helpful in reducing some of those anxieties. So, and again, I think it's really important that you can direct mum to the resources that we will put on these slides, because that's something that might help mum to know, how am I going to help Sarah with some of this anxiety that she's displaying. Okay, so that's my slides. I will pass you on to Karen, who will carry on with the next ones.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'm afraid of the time, and we've got 2 more case studies to go through. That questions, so I'll try to get through these as quickly but as informative as I can for you. So I know that you're probably all really busy. Case study is found her first year set difficult and harmed as a result. After the Christmas holidays, Claire got anxious when she was in school, which led to a reduced timetable. Her attendance duty. Claire liked lockdown as she did not feel the pressure of going to school and was able to keep up with the schoolwork online. Claire doesn't. You might find that for some of the young people that it's more the kind of the second half that they like the lockdown, because there wasn't the pressure of being in school, being in that classroom environment, and they might struggle to kind of go back. Some of them might be that more kind of quiet, anxious people that were in class before that you might not have noticed were anxious, but now that lockdowns happen, that going back into that environment might be a little bit anxiety provoking for them. So when we think about the anxiety cycle for Claire, the situation is, she doesn't want to go back to school. She knows that it made her anxious before. So some thoughts might be, I can't go into the building. It's too scary. What if I get too anxious? And that'll obviously lead to feelings of anxiety, feeling scared, maybe feeling overwhelmed. Again, going back to that into that classroom environment after being off for so long and kind of doing all the work on your own over a computer screen. So again, into that body sensations about breathing faster, heart rate wobbly, that kind of jelly legs, or feeling butterflies in her tummy. And what you might see then is that some of the behaviours, she might just stay at home, she might just avoid school altogether, and that's a really common one. We know that when there's situations that make us feel anxious, the feelings aren't really nice, so we know if we just avoid that situation, we're not going to feel like that. But if she does manage to make it into school, she might run out of class, or she might hide in the toilets, again, that little bit of kind of avoidance. Or we might see that she starts to self-harm again. So thinking about how to support Claire. So again, there's all that universal ones. Thinking about, the relaxation exercises, distractions. If we know that she's been anxious before, what worked before, what helped her. Identifying that anxiety cycle with her as well might be helpful too. And I guess when we're thinking about I'm just going to jump to the school bit first. Thinking about what would make the transition back to school easier. If she was on a reduced timetable before, can she go back to that? Is it about telling her, you're not going to come back into full time just because this is a new school year, or that kind of fresh start, that maybe a reduced timetable might be more helpful for her. Because we know the anxiety has been more long-standing, she had difficulties way back in December, does she then require more specialist interventions? Do you need to think about educational psychology? Or Liam, if your school has access to a Liam trained practitioner, or maybe even a referral to CAMHS might be appropriate. And again, thinking about monitoring for any possible risk. We know that she's self-harmed before. If that starts again, we need to look at any, thinking about that a little bit. And follow your school protocols around that. You'll all have something in place around kind of risk management, but don't be afraid to have that conversation with her if you feel comfortable. It's not going to make it worse by talking about it. And thinking about things for at home, so thinking about connecting up with parents, and talking about the longer term effects of avoidance. We know that avoiding these situations will give that short-term relief. But in the long term, it'll make it more difficult for her to get back into school. She might feel that she's more anxious because she's been avoiding it for a long time, and she won't learn that her anxiety will decrease if she stays in that situation, and if she has all that tools and skills to kind of help her manage that too. You might want to think about suggesting that she drives or walk past the school. I guess on that first day, seeing that school building might cause all that feelings of anxiety and overwhelming and things like that. So if she's maybe seen it a little bit before, that can kind of help with that feeling a little bit, kind of bring that down. The more she sees it, the more she kind of gets used to it. And thinking about what feelings that does kind of provoke in her. Is it that anxious feelings? What can we do to kind of help support that? And you can spend some time before her first day preparing, so getting her to think about getting her school uniform ready, getting her school items like her bag or any items she is allowed to bring in ready. I guess on that first day, we want to kind of set her up for success. We don't want her to be stressed out because she can't find her shoes or can't find, a book or something that she needs, so that she goes to school in that kind of low anxiety kind of way, that the morning's been quite successful, so then that's not setting her up to be all stressed before she even gets to school. And again, we've got lots of kind of CAMHS resources around that, which there'll be a link at the end there. And the last one is Alex. So Alex is an S2 and has autism spectrum condition. He required a lot of support to help him manage the transition to secondary school. Alex's dad has started to talk to him about some changes that might be happening in school. He doesn't cope well with these changes and is finding it hard to understand what these changes may be or look like, such as when his dad tells him when he needs to keep left. He's worried he might forget some of the new rules, and he struggles when he or others break these rules. He likes and knows the routine of school and is feeling worried that this might be different when he goes back. So again, that kind of anxiety cycle for Alex. There's too many changes at school. He doesn't understand them. He's worried he won't remember them. It's also worth noting that for some children with autism, they might find it difficult to access some of the thoughts that they have around some feelings. But we know from Alex that he doesn't understand what's going on, some of those signs, and we know that he doesn't like changes because he found it really hard to transition to secondary school. So that might be some of the thoughts that that's kind of going on for Alex. And then that leaves the feelings of overwhelmed, confusion, anxious. Again, you know, if Alex has lots of sensory issues, then going into that classroom environment again might be really quite overwhelming for him. Some body sensations, he might feel sick, he might feel like everything sounds really loud. And that might lead to behaviours around, you know, he might be bouncing on his toes, he might be asking lots of questions, looking for that reassurance, finding it hard to concentrate on his work. Or you might hear reports of him lashing out at home or kind of having that meltdowns. And, you know, I'm sure that's really quite common that you hear of children who seem to manage or cope quite well in school or appear to, but then when they go home, that's when they kind of release all that anger, all that frustration, all that anxiety, and that's, you know, their parents are kind of having to deal with that. Or similarly, you might see the opposite where they kind of hold it in at home and then schools where they kind of release it. So some strategies for Alex. So again, all that kind of universal ones might be helpful. I guess more specifically thinking about the visual aids, the social stories, comic strips, you know, explaining all those changes, making sure that you've got clear and specific language. I know that Holly and Anastasia kind of touched on that a little bit, making sure that they understand things like keep left. And using kind of repetition and making sure you're breaking it down, and that sensory considerations as well. And I guess some more specific questions and thinking about sending photos, videos with these changes, reminding him that everyone's learning these new rules, and that there might be times where and that's okay, but you know, maybe helping him remember, you know, to remind him of them, and just say, okay, maybe next time we can try and remember them, or thinking about ways that might help him to remember them as well. If possible, if supports using all that other kind of strategies to kind of help with those changes, but also think about what works best for Alex. So it might be that Alex needs a lot of time to kind of process these changes, needs all that time for that repetition to kind of ask lots of questions, to kind of understand that change before it happens, whether that's, you know, maybe a few weeks beforehand. But for some children, that kind of advanced warning can make them more anxious. They need a really kind of short term, like the day before, this is what's going to happen, and they manage better with that rather than, you know, a kind of a week in advance, because maybe that's more time for them to worry about it. So it's about individual and what works best for them. Is it better to know in advance or a day in advance, and thinking about that? To have that open communication with home, thinking about if at home they maybe put in strategies that worked really well, you then use them at school. Was there strategies that home and school had before lockdown that homes made adjustments to that's again worked really well, and just thinking of that kind of that consistency, whether it's things at school that work really well now, about making sure that home are aware of that and just keep it. And at home could do, they could think about what might in to reduce any anxiety. So Alex knows he's going to wear the same morning routine in the morning before going to school, and that might help reduce some of that anxiety and all that. Say the same and making sure that they can change. Okay, so we're just going to summarise there. So all families are likely to have had very different experiences during the pandemic. You know, it's that kind of phrase, we're all in the same boat, which is true to some extent, but that journey is going to look a lot different for each family. And I guess if we think about our own experience of it compared to maybe when you're colleagues, that's going to be different as well. And to remember that the anxiety on returning to school is going to be expected, it's going to be really normal, and it will present in different ways within the school environment. So thinking about if there is any changes to children's behaviour, thinking about is that anxiety, what can we do to kind of support that. And normalising it with the children as well, making sure that they know that everyone's feeling a little bit worried about going back to school. That could be really helpful too. And again, all that strategies that we've kind of talked about. But if you do find that after kind of a reasonable time that some anxiety isn't reducing, or you've put in all these kind of strategies and nothing's changing, it's having this kind of significant impact on their day, it's maybe affecting things outside of school, then maybe you need to kind of put in some more specialist interventions, whether that's Liam or referral to CAMHS, or get the family to kind of go to their GP for some support. And we've just put, if your school would like any more information on Liam, you can just email that email address there. Okay, so I think that's us. We are on to some questions now. If you want to kind of pop some questions in the chat, we will try work through as many as we can. I know that it's now 1 o'clock and we've kind of overran a little bit. But if you do have any questions, pop them in, and afterwards we'll kind of put some of those questions if we're not able to answer them today.
I've also popped the evaluation form in the chat. If everyone could fill that out as well, that would be great if you've got to head off. But otherwise, yeah, feel free to ask questions.
And we'll also send it via email, I think, won't we, Natasha? Yeah. If you haven't got any questions, feel free to head off.
I know some of you might have a couple of people in the room as well. So if there's a couple of people in the room, if everyone could fill out the form, that would be great for us as well. Not just the kind of main computer. So Arlene, we'll be sending all the slides through via email out to everyone, and then if there's any kind of specific questions, we'll be sending that through a frequently asked question sheet as well. And then once the recording's available, that'll be on the CAMHS website, so you'll have the slides plus the recording and any questions on a sheet as well. So
to some of the resources, it is CAMHS, so that's it there at the bottom, CAMHS resource pack. You can click on there and get those resources there. Okay. Oh, and Holly's popped it on the chat. Thanks, Holly.
So I think if there's no more questions, then we'll just finish the webinar here. We'll just hang around until everyone leaves, just in case there's any lingering questions that some people think of on the way out. But everyone's free to head off, and we'll send the evaluation form round as well if you didn't manage to access it in the chat. Thank you very much for coming, everyone, as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.